We're continuing our study of the life of Christ. We're actually now in a new part of the 13-part series. We're in part 11, which is called Prophecies in Preparation for the Death of Christ, and it's largely the Olivet Discourse. So from our chart, we're again in this last section of the chart, but also getting very near the last section of the way that Dr. Thomas divides it up in the Harmony of the Gospels. So this is the Olivet Discourse. It's the sixth of the six major discourses in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew really organizes his Gospel around these large blocks of teaching material that Christ delivers. And here they are, the Sermon on the Mount. These are all the ones that we've covered. Commissioning of the 12, where he sends out the 12 to do the same kind of works that he had done and they had seen him do, and also proclaim the nearness of the kingdom. The mysteries of the kingdom, which were the parables in Matthew 13 that Christ turned to, particularly after the leaders of Israel said that he cast out demons by the ruler of demons. Life in the kingdom, or kingdom citizenship in Matthew 18. The seven woes to Israel's leaders, or teachers, scribes and Pharisees. There's 8, as we noted, I guess that was last week or 2 weeks ago, if you count the ones that show up in Mark and Luke. And then this one, Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. It's a really important discourse. As you can imagine, by this point, Christ is still Tuesday of Passion Week. He's already had this strong confrontation with Israel's leaders on Tuesday morning, and now he's leading his disciples out over to the Mount of Olives, and he's really got to start preparing them even more for the time that he's going to be away from them. He's already done that a little bit. He's going to do it a lot, both in this Olivet Discourse and also when we get to the upper room and his instruction from the upper room over to the Garden of Gethsemane. He's going to talk a lot about the time that he's away there as well. Each one of these, if perhaps you've done this already, but I would encourage you to do it if not. In Matthew's Gospel, each one of these sections are marked off by what we call an introductory formula and a closing formula. And it just, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, it talks about the fact that he sat down with his disciples and he opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, and then there's 5 through 7, and at the end there's a closing formula of, they heard these teaching. It's a really bad paraphrase, but they heard the teaching of Christ and they were amazed at the authority with which he taught. Each one of these discourses are marked off that way. Okay, so here's the way that we're going to outline these two chapters, Matthew 24 and 25. We're only going to get probably through verse 41 of chapter 24 this morning, but we have the setting of the discourse, which is kind of like that introductory formula that I just mentioned. And then we have a description really of Daniel's 70th week. Now, I'm going to show another chart. I know those of you that were here, which is most of you, when we did the study in Revelation, we talked a lot about what this chart looked like. But it was really based on from Daniel chapter 9. And we can see a lot of correspondences between what Christ sketches out in the Olivet Discourse with what the book of Revelation shows as far as the 7-sealed scroll. The dividing mark between the beginning of birth pangs, which are things that are going to happen, but they're not marking the very end. It's difficulties that Christ wants to prepare the disciples and us, including us, for, but it leads to things that are worse. So just like with the 7-sealed scroll, you have the first 6 seals are bad. There's no question about it, but it leads to things that are even worse. And it's a fitting metaphor, right? Like for those of you that have had children, it starts out with birth pangs and it gets worse and worse, the pain does, until the child's delivered. So the abomination of desolation is the halfway point of Daniel's 70th week. Then we have a description of the coming of the Son of Man and signs of nearness but unknown time. So just like for us, right, we've talked a lot lately, especially about the importance of living in light of Christ's return and recognizing that that's out there. We don't know exactly when. We know that there's nothing else that has to be fulfilled before he comes, but we don't know the date, and it's a good thing we don't know the date, right? Because we kind of plan accordingly, and that's not the way that God intends for it to be. I mean, as Christ is talking to his disciples in this discourse, he said he even didn't know the day of his return. But we're to live in expectancy that it could come at any time. So that's the point of those verses. And then next week, we'll look at these parables that Christ delivers on the same occasion that are really instruction of, okay, here's the way it's going to be. Here's what's going to happen. Now here's how you need to live in light of that. And it's very much the same idea of living in light of Christ's return. Special emphasis on watchfulness and faithfulness. So that's what those 5 parables are going to talk about. And then we have the judgment at the Son of Man's coming in chapter 25. I think a very clear passage and instruction that the fact that Christ's reign will be on the earth. It's after he returns in power and glory that he sits upon his throne. And I make that point because some people would argue that he's sitting on his throne now at the Father's right hand. He's sitting on a throne now, to be sure. It's the Father's throne. His throne is in Jerusalem, on the throne of David, as his ancestor. So we'll see that very clearly in the last part of chapter 25. Okay? So let's review again, just kind of set the stage of what we've seen already in Passion Week. Christ comes in on Sunday in the triumphal entry. He's hailed as the King of Israel. Comes into the temple, looks around a little bit, and leaves. He comes back in on Monday. And both on Monday and Tuesday, he's teaching and instructing not only his disciples, but also having this confrontation with the religious leaders, especially on Tuesday morning. That's what we have next, is this head-on challenge to his authority, and then he turns the tables and begins to challenge them. They're trying to trap him and really trying to find something that they can bring him up on charges to the Romans that would result in his crucifixion. They couldn't do that themselves at that time. But Christ turns the tables and starts rebuking Israel's leaders. Very strong rebuke in Matthew 23. He rebukes them for things like hypocrisy, their desire to be noticed for their quote-unquote spirituality, to be respected by men rather than to be pleasing to God, their misunderstanding of truth. And that was a huge thing that they were responsible for. I mean, I think that's what Christ is doing in the Sermon on the Mount, is correcting a lot of things that the Pharisees had added to the law. And because they were teachers, they had an even higher accountability. And then the neglect of the weightier matters of the law. So that's what the 7 woes that Christ goes after these religious leaders are all about. The climax of that rebuke is this, in 23 verses 37 to 39. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, and that again is not just talking about the city, but really the nation as a whole, represented by the city, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's really going to leave the temple itself for the last time. He's going to be back in the city after he's arrested. But he's really leaving the religious leaders and leaving the nation, as it were, in a representative way. And obviously he's going to make some appearances after his resurrection to different groups of people, but to the nation as a whole, he's really not going to make an appearance the way that he has at his first coming until he comes back and until they recognize him truly as the Messiah. So Jesus then leaves the temple. He crosses over the Kidron Valley to the east of where the temple and the city are, and to the Mount of Olives with his disciples. And that's in the first 3 verses of 24. That's going to provide the setting of this discourse. Before I read those verses, I just want to show you, that one's blank. This is what it would look like if you're to the south and you're looking towards the north. The temple is here. You've got the Hinnom Valley down here to the south of the city, and then the Kidron Valley running on the east side. So the Mount of Olives is over here. Now, if you're just looking at this model, you'd say, whoa, that's a pretty steep drop there. How does he get from the temple complex across this and up into the Mount of Olives? It's not that steep, actually. This is what it would look like if you were there today. You're on the Mount of Olives. You're looking over, in this case, not to the temple, although that's where the temple would be, you're looking at the Dome of the Rock at that point. But you can see the valley there is definitely something that you can cross, and it is an incline to get up onto the Mount of Olives. But here's what, this is the model that I've shown to you before. This is what it would look like as far as they cross the valley, the disciples are looking back at the temple, and it was a glorious thing. I mean, the thing sits up on a hill. You can see all the city around it is lower, so it's this magnificent thing that's higher, and they're looking up at it. And the disciples are saying, look how beautiful this place is. This is something that Herod had worked on to restore the glory of the temple for 46 years. And that's what launches the discourse. So let's read those verses now. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 1. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. They're going to ask him a couple of questions. When will these things be? What things?
The things you were just talking about.
Exactly. So particularly the destruction of the temple, because that's what they had just pointed out to him, and that's what he had just responded and say, hey, this place is about to be wasted. And that would subsequently occur in AD 70. The second question was, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, for us especially, this is clear that he's talking about what's going to happen right before Christ comes back. I think in the disciples' mind, it was likely that they connected those two things together. The destruction of the temple would be the prelude to the return of Christ, or to the coming of Christ, and to the establishment of his kingdom. Now, Jesus, and this is not unusual, right? We've seen this in Old Testament prophecy, and Jesus is providing prophecy here. He really didn't describe that there was going to be this long period of separation between 70 AD and his return. I think part of the reason, or at least to me it makes sense that part of the reason he would do this is he wants to encourage that expectation, that expectancy again, so they're not really trying to calculate, hey, the temple's going to be destroyed. We know that Christ is coming back soon in light of that. But they're constantly thinking, as has the church ever since this discourse was given and recorded in Matthew, that Christ is coming back. Not really trying to provide a means of calculating, okay, if this sign happens, then we know it's exactly this long period of time until his return. It doesn't really work that way. But it does give you an idea of, it does give us enough idea of things that will happen to lead up to the return of Christ.
Excuse me, Frank.
Sure.
That picture you keep showing us of the temple.
Yes.
The Temple of Solomon was originally destroyed by the Babylonians, and then it was destroyed again by the Romans. Is this the reproduction? Because that looks like a pretty substantial building.
It is. And so this will be the temple that was a model of the temple that was in Christ's day. And remember, after Solomon's temple was destroyed, it was rebuilt by the exiles. Now, it would have been enhanced to this because Herod was a great builder, and he really wanted to curry the favor of the Jews. So he took the basic temple structure that was rebuilt by the exiles. And remember, even after the exiles rebuilt it, they wept because they didn't feel like it was as glorious as Solomon's temple.
That looks pretty remarkable.
It is.
And if it's not as good as Solomon's was, what must that one have been like?
Exactly. Yeah,
Wow.
I think it was more glorious. But at the same time, I think this one was probably better than what the exiles saw, and because of all the work that Herod had done to improve it. It is you can imagine it'd just be a remarkable thing to see.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a painting at home that shows modern day Jerusalem like the other picture that we saw. It looks like this, but it has the temple instead of the Dome of the Rock in place up there. Mm-hmm. And, we believe that there will be a future temple described in Ezekiel 40 through 48, 40 through 43 in particular, that will be on that same spot. I mean, this is the same piece of real estate where Solomon's temple was. This was the place that has always been designated as the place for the temple. It won't be built anywhere else.
So is the Wailing Wall just outside there? Or
Yes.
It's got to be right next to it then.
That's right.
And that was part of the wall of the temple.
The original temple,
Original
that's
temple.
right. Some of these other walls that you see in this picture were built by the Turks during the Ottoman Empire, and the walls have been redone a number of times through the years. But that section right there that you're talking about, the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, was part of the original wall.
So it's got to be real close to that then, because if that's on the original piece of real estate,
Yes.
it's got to be right. And the Arabs don't mind that wall
So
there?
it's a,
Or is it a sore thumb for them, or?
well, just as it's a sore thumb for that mosque to be on the Judas place. I was going to say it's a powder keg if you go to Jerusalem today, because you've got Arabs and Christians and Muslims and Christians and Jews all living in very tight quarters right there and all having particular space. You know, obviously the Jews want that place gone, that mosque gone, and yet they've worked out enough cooperation between them where even though the Muslims control the Temple Mount, they'll let people go up there and visit. They'll let them come into their place. They'll let them, just visit where that big space where the temple used to be. So it's really an unusual arrangement. I mean, Israel itself is just, the whole country is an unusual arrangement because of the way the political situation is and the way that the religious situation is.
No.
There was, I think it was during the 6-Day War in '67, where the Jews actually took over the Temple Mount, and they went up and put an Israeli flag on the top of that mosque, and they quickly took it off just because they didn't want to start a real holy war at that point.
What is that wall that's there that we're seeing, that big wall?
So that's just one of the walls of the city itself. There's
Okay.
still very clearly defined walls around the old city, and those are the ones I was talking about earlier that were built by the Turks. I mean, they would have been originally built by Israel.
By Israel, yeah.
Yeah, but they've had to be rebuilt a number of times during history, through history.
All the wars and all that
That's
stuff
right.
that's gone on over the years.
Exactly.
Wow. Thank you.
Sure. So there's two questions. Well, we did that already, didn't we? Let's talk a little bit before we go further in Christ's answer to those questions about the structure of Daniel's 70th week. Well, the first thing I want to do is read the prophecy from Daniel chapter 9. Remember, this came in response to Daniel's prayer, and he was in a situation where he'd been reading the prophet Jeremiah, and he knew that Israel's exile was supposed to last 70 years. And he knew that that was coming close to an end. So he was motivated to pray for the restoration of the nation of Israel. And after he prayed, he received a vision that the angel told him, look, it's not going to be just 70 years. Even though there were going to be things that happened after 70 years, they were going to be allowed to return to the land and rebuild the temple and the city walls. But it's going to be 77s of years before Israel's truly liberated and restored the way that the Old Testament scriptures predicted that she would be. So let's read, starting in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. 70 weeks or 77s have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So we don't have time this morning to go through all of what's described there, but he's basically laying out the long-range plan for the redemption of Israel and the restoration of the city and the nation. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and that took place back in like 445 BC, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. In other words, a total of 69 weeks, 69 times 7 number of years from this decree to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. And people have worked this out, doing the math. Sir Robert Anderson is a guy that's done it and wrote a little book about it. But you calculate out the number of days, and it comes down exactly to the day that Christ came in on the triumphal entry. If any of you are interested in exploring that further, I can refer that book to you. So that's what the first 69 sevens come out to. It's the the time during Daniel's day, or roughly during that time, until Messiah the Prince is 69 sevens of years, and that leads all the way down to the triumphal entry of Christ. He says, the city, will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, and again, you have to be kind of careful how you read this. You might expect after the 69 weeks, but there's 7 weeks first and then 62. After the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. What's that a reference to?
He'll be crucified.
Exactly. He's killed.
Now, when you say exactly the time of the Messiah, is that exactly to the day that he was crucified?
No.
Or the day that he was born?
There was a day that he came into the city as triumphal entry. So the Sunday of Passion Week.
The last Passion Week. Okay.
That's right. And we say, well, that's how it works out, but it makes sense. Until Messiah the Prince, they were recognizing him at that day as the King of Israel. And then after that day, and after the fulfillment of those 69 weeks, Christ is killed. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. What's that a reference to?
It's the 70 AD destruction.
Very good. So he's talking about these events that happen after the 69 weeks are fulfilled. One is really close in time, and that's the crucifixion of Christ. The second is some 40 years down the road, but he's not really distinguishing that. He's just saying both of those things will happen after the first 69 weeks. Its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he, who's the he? It's not, you got to really pay attention here, and this happens in Scripture. You got to go back to what the most immediate referent would be.
He is the Antichrist.
Okay, he is, but how do we know that from just reading Daniel 9? If you go back a couple of verses, what is the pronoun he referring to? It's the prince who is to come. So the people of the prince who is to come are the ones that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, but he is this false Christ. And again, there's a long gap of time before he comes on the scene, but he does. And he'll make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Again, keep in mind, the word is not really week, it's for 1/7, and it's in years. So we've already had 69 sevens of years. Now we've got 1/70th week, or 7 of years.
The tribulation period.
That's right. He'll make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. So evidently this covenant is with the nation of Israel. It allows them to restore their system of worship. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have a full-blown temple at that time. We know that they will have a temple eventually, but they're at least allowed to build an altar on this place where they've always had this altar for offering sacrifice, and be able to worship like they have in the past with sacrifices. Now, it looks good initially, but in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Again, that's the false Christ. Even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. That's talking about the destruction of the false Christ at the very end of this week. So let me just try to draw this out for you. Obviously, the rapture of the church is not mentioned in Daniel 9 because the church doesn't exist. Nobody knows what the church is in Daniel 9. But that's what kicks off this 70th week, which we would also know as the day of the Lord. It's divided into 2 halves, marked off halfway by the abomination of desolation, where the false Christ takes its place in the temple. The first 3.5 years, if we switch now to Matthew 24, is the beginning of birth pangs, and the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. And we make that conclusion because the abomination of desolation is mentioned in the Olivet Discourse. So again, you see a lot of similarity between what Christ talks about in Matthew 24 and 25 to what John, the Apostle John, talks about in the book of Revelation. John obviously would have been there at the Olivet Discourse. He was one of the 12. The first 6 seals of the 7 seal scroll take place roughly over the period of the first 3.5 years. Now, we're not going to go to Revelation 6, but think about what happens particularly in the first 4 seals of the 7 sealed scroll. There's a false peace established by the false Christ, or by many false Christs. That's followed by warfare and bloodshed. That's followed by famine, and that's followed by death, like pestilence, exactly. So those things are mentioned. We'll see that they're mentioned in the Olivet Discourse by Christ. I used to think and was convinced that when he makes that prediction in Matthew 24, he's only talking about it in the sense of the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. I'm now more convinced that, and those things, think about how general those things are, right? You've had warfare throughout history. You've certainly had quite a bit of it from the time that Christ spoke these words until now. You've had false Christ, both very close in time after Christ makes this prediction, and even in our own day, you've had people claim to be the Messiah. You've had famine in different parts of the world, and you've had earthquakes. So that's another thing that I didn't mention. But so I think the point here is, yeah, you got all these things are going to happen, but that's only the beginning of birth pangs. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're at the very end. You hear people say, in light of certain things that happened during our day and even the earlier days, Christ must be coming back soon because of these things that have happened. And yet he hasn't come yet. But the abomination of desolation really ends the beginning of birth pangs and starts very intense tribulation. And so if you're looking at the book of Revelation, that's when the 7th seal is broken, which reveals the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls. And that is the great tribulation that's unlike any other tribulation that's ever been before or ever will be after. And then, you know, the church has already gone up to be with the Lord in glorified bodies. There's been a number of people saved over this 7-year period, but all those saints come back. There's resurrection at the end of the 7 years for those in Christ, but not yet, that weren't part of the church. And Christ himself comes this time, not just in the air and catching up believers to himself in the air, but he comes all the way back to the earth and takes his throne, the throne of David in Jerusalem. So I just think it's helpful to have this background from Daniel 9, and now we'll start reading the Olivet Discourse itself. So let's look at verse 4, and this is the beginning of birth pangs recorded for us in Matthew 24, 4 through 14. Now, Mark and Luke also record different parts of the Olivet Discourse, and it's helpful again to read this in the harmony. Luke really talks explicitly more about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but there's a lot of similarity in the language between all 3 accounts. Jesus answered and said to them, and again, this is in response to their question, especially what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. Jesus said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. Again, we see warnings about that in 1 John. We know from history that there have been a number of people that have claimed to be the Christ, and he's telling them ahead of time, look, don't be ready for this, know this, and don't be suckered. Don't let somebody tell you that they're the Christ when they're not. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not frightened, for those things must take place, but that's not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. Again, we see that all through history. Even before Christ said this, But we certainly see it from the time that he set it up to now. We see it a lot in our own day. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. Now again, certainly the apostles are going to experience that kind of persecution, but I would argue that there are other followers of Christ in this in-between time that have suffered the same fate. And at that time, many will fall away and will deliver up one another and hate one another. I think he's talking about people that have claimed an association with Christ, but fall away from the faith, and even are willing to deliver up those who still follow Christ. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, and because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. And again, I would argue that that is the trend of history, is that wickedness has increased. I don't know how you can read this and be postmillennial and say somehow that the world is being Christianized today, the gospel is just overcoming all wickedness, and it's going to continue that way until Christ comes back. We're just not making that kind of progress. It's obvious from what we see, it's obvious from the New Testament that that's not what's going to happen. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. Endures in the sense of holding fast to the faith. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come. Now, again, we're doing that today as the church, right? We're taking the gospel all over the world, in different parts of the world. There's obviously different percentages of genuine believers in different countries. But I think this is making reference more to what's described in Revelation, where you've got this eagle flying in mid-heaven and having an eternal gospel to preach. There's going to be a point during the tribulation, and it's getting close to the very end, where the gospel is being proclaimed in a supernatural way to all the inhabitants of the earth. There's still going to be a lot of people that are rejected at that point, but I think that's what he's referring to in verse 14. Kathleen.
Okay, so in verse 13, endures to the end, that means someone who is truly saved will not doubt that they're saved. So they can be assured themselves that they are, we would say, go to heaven now.
Yeah, I don't think it's speaking to that. I mean, I think you can be a genuine Christian and have doubts at different times.
Sure, but you can have doubts about all kinds of things, but if you really saw you were a sinner and you really saw who God was and that he had died for you and everything else, that's a real thing in your life. You know this happened. And if you are able to hang on to the faith in that had happened, then you're one of the ones that is truly saved.
That's right. And
I think that's might be saying that.
I do. I think so too, especially as you contrast it with those who fall away.
Because there's going to be all this false teaching out there that could be saying other stuff about being saved.
Oh, sure. I mean, you've even got a false Christ, and he's dominating the scene such that people are embracing him as the true Christ. So obviously the ones that do that won't be persecuted, right? Because that's the world system at the time. But for those that know the true Christ, well, one, you got to remember that the church has already been taken up when all this takes place. But you will have people that are saved during the tribulation that will be put to death because they hold to the truth.
But they'll know that was the truth because they came to that point where they were able to be saved.
Yes.
So they know this is real.
That's right.
They've wrestled through it, and they can count on the fact that they will endure.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean they won't die physically, but
that's right.
They're not going to be caught up in all this deception and stuff.
Yeah, I think the main point he's making in 13 is that it is the one who stays faithful and perseveres that will be saved, as opposed to those who fall away and reject Christ.
Because I think they'll see that everything as evil. They will see, if you're a believer at that point,
they'll recognize all the
they'll
others.
realize this is all evil and I'm not going with it.
That's
And
right.
they might be sneaking or whatever they might be doing, but their heart is not believing that testimony.
That's right. Okay, so that really is describing the period up to the abomination of desolation that we looked at. I want to just quickly read you some references that talk about birth pangs and how that's a very common figure for this time of tribulation. These are from the Old Testament, but also in 1 Thessalonians 5. I'll just read through these quickly just so you can hear the phrase. It's very important to interpret both the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation against the background of the Old Testament. Isaiah 13:6, well, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. And they will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Isaiah 26:17, as the pregnant woman approaches the time to give birth, she rises and cries out in her labor pains, thus were we before thee, O Lord. And some of these even have reference to the coming of the Babylonians to take Judah, but the idea is the same. It's a time where this figure is used as Israel is becoming troubled and persecuted. Jeremiah 30 verse 6, ask now and see if a male can give birth. Why do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in childbirth? Again, it's just a very graphic figure of the fear and mainly the fear that is coming over these people. Why have all faces turned pale? Alas, for that day is great. There's none like it. It is the time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. Micah 4:9. Now, why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you, or has your counselor perished? That agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth. Writhe in labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth, for now you will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to Babylon. So that is talking about the Babylonian exile. There you'll be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. And then finally, Paul writes this, talking about the day of the Lord and how it will be a surprise to some and not to others in 1 Thessalonians 5. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like birth pangs upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So that's the background of the figure that Christ uses in the Olivet Discourse. All right, so now we get to the second half of Daniel's 70th week, the abomination of desolation marking it off. It does end the birth pangs and begins the great tribulation. And it, again, just like birth pangs for a woman get more and more intense as they go along until the delivery, so the punishments, the wrath of God being poured out, the difficulty of living in that day increases until Christ comes back. Matthew 24, verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, he's talking about that very passage that we read in Daniel 9, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Now, your Bible may have that last part set off in parentheses, as if Matthew is writing that as a commentary. I think it's words spoken by Christ, and he's talking about let the reader of Daniel understand that this is what we're talking about here in this discourse. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. What's the main emphasis there?
Hurry.
Hurry. Get out of Dodge. Get to the mountains. Get somewhere where you can get away from this. Now, at this point, I think you can make the argument that he's talking about destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And you have to understand that there's a relationship between those two things. Destruction in 70 AD is what we would call a prototype or harbinger of what it's going to be like in the Great Tribulation in the very end. In both cases, the thrust of what he's talking about here is just how difficult it is and will be during those times. What do those who are with child and to those who nurse babes in those days? Why?
slow going.
It's slow going. It's just harder to get away, harder to run. Pray that your flight might not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, again, because it's just going to be more difficult. They were actually limited as to how far they could travel on a Sabbath day, and if they tried to abide by that, they might be hindered in getting away from all this.
I've read that in modern day Israel, the buses don't work. They don't run on the Sabbath. And also the wadis can fill up. The wadis can get filled up in the wintertime. And the roads go right down into the wadis and back up again. They don't put the bridges over them. That's what I read. So you could have a full wadi in your way.
Yes, and make it more difficult to travel. I want to read the part of Luke 2.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, go ahead.
I read that Basra was in the mountains and that they knew to run to Basra. It was a big long thing that I read. That's why they were to run to the mountains.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in general, they're just getting higher
Old
ground.
Testament prophecies about something. I'm afraid I read it about a week and a half ago before anything happened.
Yeah, I
That
don't,
doesn't ring a bell?
no, not to me. It doesn't mean it's not true. So if you do look at Luke's account, Luke 21 verse 20 says, and again, this is not recorded exactly the same way in Matthew, but to me it's more explicit that he is talking about destruction of Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are in the midst of the city depart, and let not those who are in the country enter the city. So the idea is to get away from the city because that's where the enemy has come, and that's what they're going to destroy. Because these are days of vengeance, in order that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Woe to those who are with child and those who nurse babes in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, all that happened in 70 AD. I mean, since then, you've had a pretty significant return back to the land of Israel by Israelites, but you've got more people living outside of Israel today than you do inside, including here in the United States, huge Jewish population here. So the fact that the Dome of the Rock and the Alaska Mosque are on Temple Mount also proves that this is the time that the Gentiles are trampling underfoot the city of Jerusalem. We're still in those days right now.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
This wrath is the wrath of God
It is.
against Israel.
Yeah.
So you flee if you're now beginning to obey the scriptures.
I think people are going to flee naturally anyway.
Yeah.
I think he's just warning them really more than anything how difficult this is going to be.
The Jewish leadership back then isn't doing what they've done all along to say, no, the safest place is to be right here.
I don't think they were saying that in 70 AD for sure.
Apparently they were. That's why they stayed for the siege when they knew the Romans were approaching.
Well, the way a siege works.
Wasn't Jeremiah saying, we got to get out of here. We got to just go to peace with the Babylonians and surrender.
But you're going back to the Old Testament now.
Yeah.
I'm talking about 70 AD when the Roman armies come. I mean, they do surround the city, and there's no way out to some degree. But once those things started happening, the smart thing to do was to flee
Where could they flee?
to the mountains, out of Judea, out of Jerusalem.
I'm just saying this, I thought they're fleeing before the armies get there and what we're doing now.
Well, it
That's why
says
they can get out.
it says when
70
you
AD, they couldn't get out.
they couldn't get out, but they didn't know it was going to be 70 AD when Christ was telling them this. And what he says is, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, then know their desolation's hand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. I don't think they're going to flee to the mountains knowing that one day the Romans were going to come. They were going to wait until it looked more serious, and then they would try to get out.
Right. But you think this is 70 AD? You don't think this is the middle of the tribulation?
I think it's both. I think that the discourse is as recorded by both Matthew and Luke and Mark for that matter, are really talking about both events without separating them very clearly. I think the temple was desecrated by Gentiles at 70 AD just because they came up there and destroyed it. But there's also a future temple that would be
That was the
desecrated.
punishment for that generation. But Israel itself gets really punished in the tribulation.
Well, I would say they got really punished then too.
Yeah, but I mean,
It's even worse in the tribulation, to be sure.
the generation that rejected Christ, they brought 70 AD on.
Yes.
But the ongoing sin of Israel brings on the Great Tribulation.
That's a good way to put it.
At any point, they could have turned and said, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." But of course, I mean, God's timing and everything.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the generation thing here in just a minute. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days shall be cut short. Cut short in the sense of limited. It's not like God planned for it to be this long and then he changed his mind and made it this long. I think it just means all of this is emphasizing how incredibly difficult the days are going to be, and God puts a limit on it so that some will survive. Well,
Going back to the previous verse, if the believers are told to flee to the mountains, I thought their role during the tribulation period was to evangelize, not to survive. Is that just pure survival? Like, it feels like that's what he's saying.
well, 144,000 in the book of Revelation are the ones that will really survive. You've got, and again, I'm going to Revelation at this point because you have more information than you do here in the Olivet Discourse about that question. You've got Israel being transported to the wilderness at a certain point during the tribulation period, and that's when they come to recognize their Messiah, and they are kind of sequestered there. They're not being persecuted the way that they would be if they were under the reign of the false Christ. So it depends on where you are during the tribulation period, and also the 144,000 are more the missionary evangelists during the tribulation period than the nation as a whole.
So these are unbelieving Jews as well, fleeing
70 AD.
in the tribulation. Any Jew is mostly just because they're not saved, as in general, they're not saved yet.
Yeah, I think anybody's going to flee that's facing that kind of prospect, just like you would in any war. You're going to try to get out of the way of what's happening. Okay, verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, "Behold, here's the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe him. So again, there's a reference back to